Dr. Dina?
I've started.
Good evening, colleagues and friends. It's our pleasure and honor in APTAU and its academic forum to welcome you all to our third monthly event, which will be wholly devoted to translation and its ongoing challenges. This is a very special activity with a very special and distinguished speaker, Professor Mohammad Asfour Abu Firas. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Asfour. Professor Asfour, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Professor Asfour has been with APTAU since 1997, the foundation year. And for me, I have known Professor Asfour in many capacities. First, as a student and teacher. In the early 70s of the 20th century, I was a student in the Department of English, a beginner. And Professor Asfour at the time was a very important pillar of the Department of English Language and Literature, a leader, an instructor, and a mentor. 20 years later or so, I knew Professor Asfour in another capacity when I joined the Department of English as a faculty member. Thanks to Professor Asfour for his support at the time and for other colleagues. And since then, I have started to know more and more of and about Professor Asfour. Professor Asfour has also served as associate editor for around 15 years. One important thing for me is when IJAS was launched in 2000, in the year 2000. Professor Asfour at the time contributed a very important paper titled Translation of Poetry, an Example from Nazik al-Malaika. In that early paper, Professor Asfour outlined and discussed the problems and challenges of translation. He said at the beginning, almost everybody agrees that poetry is what gets lost in translation. Such a challenge and many others will be the focus of his presentation. Professor Asfour's contributions to APTAU and IJAS have never come to an end. An illustrative example of this is his being with us now. Without any further ado, I call upon my colleague, Dr. Dua Salame from the Academic Forum to take the lead and officially introduce Professor Asfour and moderate the session. Dr. Dua, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamdan. Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are very pleased today and honored to host a very distinguished and prominent professor who has been teaching and contributing to the educational, academic, and cultural scene in Jordan and many other parts of the world, Professor Mohammad Asfour. I feel very lucky and honored to really introduce Professor Asfour all right. He's my teacher, my intellectual guru. Professor Asfour obtained his MA and PhD in English literature from Indiana University. Since then, he has been soaring and making great accomplishments in various fields of knowledge. It's never easy to mention enough in just a few minutes. However, Professor Asfour is an encyclopedic educator of multiple talents that have been well invested. He's a teacher, translator, critic, and also a poet. He has been teaching for more than half a century as an English professor with administrative positions, such as the head of English department, director of language center, and dean of the Faculty of Arts at several universities. He's also a prolific writer who has published many books in Arabic and English and translated many works from Arabic into English and vice versa, acting as a window and bridge for a two-way highway between Arabic and English. He is currently working at the Jordan Academy of Arabic as elected member of the Academy since 2017, heading a number of committees and providing his lifelong expertise as an ambassador, serving with unfailing dedication his own language and culture. It's so impossible to mention his every single accomplishment because they are a lot. His achievements have been recognized by many different awards, including Kuwait Institution for the Advancement of Science Award for the translation of the concept of the primitive, a very important and influential book, one of the masterpieces and a must-read book. Philadelphia University's Honorary Award for Achievement in Translation in 2004, the State Awards for Excellence in Translation in 2012, Shield of the National Center for Translation from Egypt in 2016, and Philadelphia University's Shield for Academic Excellence in 2018, just to mention a few. The list could go on for a very long time, but I want to give time for Professor Asfour to really start his talk. Thank you again, Professor Asfour, for accepting our invitation. And also thank you very much, my dear colleagues, for coming and joining us in our third seminar, which, as Professor Jihad has just said, will discuss and focus on translation and its ongoing challenges. Please welcome with me, Professor Asfour. You have the floor, Professor Asfour.
Thank you very much. I am have made me unable to speak. Yeah, I'll start reading because speaking is rather difficult for me now to express my deep feelings, deep gratitude for the kind words that I have heard from you and the other colleagues. Back to the paper itself. No. Leave. How do I do that? How do I go back? Yes, here it is. Well, translation, an ongoing challenge, and that is a very apt title because I have faced this challenge for almost half a century, shortly after I became a student, and I'm still going on with this challenge, facing it, and never being able to actually succeed fully into satisfying myself and my readers. Well, the need to translate has existed ever since there were human beings on the face of the earth. The Holy Quran puts it clearly in the following words: Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu. Or in Tarif Khalidi's translation, O mankind, we created you male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may come to know one another. Nations and tribes usually live separately and frequently at great distances from each other. This is why they tend to speak different languages. But even within the same country, different races and tribes tend to speak different languages and dialects that require the use of a common vernacular that makes it possible for the people to communicate. And one website lists 10 countries whose populations speak hundreds of languages each. Here is the topmost 5. The first is Papua New Guinea, 839 languages. Indonesia, 707 languages. Nigeria, 526 languages. India, 454 languages. The United States, 422 languages. The need to communicate, whether within the border of a country or across the borders, makes it necessary sometimes to borrow words and expressions that are native to one language, but not to others. The words borrowed may eventually be completely absorbed into the native language, but they sometimes retain their foreign flavor. In English, for example, it is estimated that words borrowed from French constitute about 45% of the vocabulary of modern English, although French and English belong to two different families of languages. Although English dictionaries used by university level students give the origins of the words listed in them, and many of them are French, these dictionaries are said to be English dictionaries, and the language being explained is the English language. Arabic dictionaries, unfortunately, are not yet provided with etymologies that trace the origins of words borrowed from other languages. The reason, I suspect, is that Arab lexicographers thought that Arabic was all that they needed, and that Arabic was somehow self-sufficient. National pride convinced them that Arabic was the greatest language in the world, and that others were ajam, i.e., unable to speak clearly. In the modern world, however, the Arabs have become aware that they are lagging far behind in terms of science and technology, and that even the humane sciences, they need to learn a great deal from others. Translation, they discovered again, is an essential means of bridging the gap between where they are on the scale of civilization and where they want to be. They discovered that to do an adequate job in translation, they needed two methods of catching up with the new terminology that is constantly expanding. And these two methods are borrowing and coining or inventing. Borrowing is obviously much easier, especially when it is a matter of adopting names of things like physical elements, as in the case of oxygen, platinum, and magnesium, or like manufactured things like jeans, mayonnaise, and macaroni, etc. There was a time in which we borrowed words like automobile, train, bicycle, and computer, but it didn't take us long to replace these terms with sayyara, qitar, daraja hawaiya or bukhariya, and hasub, although such coinages made it necessary for us to adopt consonants that not originally used in Arabic. Consonants like P in pizza, V in names like Vivian and Vance, G in Hungary and hunger, and Copenhagen, and the CH, ch, as in Churchill and Chechnya. More important than the borrowing of things with their foreign names is the borrowing of concepts and ideas, which often require derived forms, especially verbs. We have borrowed concepts like mechanization, automation, and digitalization, and we have devised verbs from them, like from the words devised verb forms like yumaknin, yu'atmit, and yuraqmin, but we have devised verbs like but we have found it difficult to derive verbs from demokratiya, dinamikiya, romanciya, classikiya, because Arabic does not allow deriving verbs from roots exceeding quadriliteral roots, and does not allow us to speak of damakrata Although the forms daqrata and maqrata are attractive, yet we feel that they miss something important, a feeling that is difficult to identify except by appealing to the innate sense in the speakers of Arabic that allows verbs or verb derivation from triliteral and quadriliteral roots, but does not allow it from quintiliteral ones. Munir Baalbaki, compiler of the well-known bilingual dictionary, Al-Mawrid, was bold enough to use the word yukamtir for computerize, but it never won acceptance. Hassan al-Karmi, compiler of Al-Mughni al-Akbar, the other well-known bilingual dictionary, in Waidus, gave the following phrase to explain the same verb. I mean, to computerize. أعمل مكانا بالآلات الحاصية. اختزن المعلومات في آلة أو آلات حاصية. The phrase الآلة الحاصية for him is what we have come to call al-hasub. The word yukamtir has failed to win acceptance because it lost one basic element of its components, that is the P. And the word al-hasiya failed because the vocabulary of a language is not devised or derived by lexicographers, but by language users. Dictionaries record what is actually used by the speakers of a language and occasionally give established senses of vocabulary items. But this illustration is usually done in encyclopedic dictionaries like the OED in English. Who has the privilege of inventing new words to be added to the vocabulary of a language? The privilege is usually claimed by the translator, who does so after digging into the treasures of the native language for terms or phrases equivalent to the foreign terms or phrases. In our heritage, the early translators encountered hundreds of terms in Greek which did not have equivalent terms with varying degrees of success. The result was the addition of many foreign words to the Arabic dictionary, words that are no longer considered foreign, like al-falsafa, wal-geographia, wal-physiya, wal-kimya, wal-sabanich, or al-isbanach, whereas words like al-ihlilaj, wal-istuqsat, wal-isturlab remained buried in some old texts that are no longer used. In modern times, Arabic has adopted many words like cinema, radio, television, but words like al-kasitat, al-scanner, al-dynamo have retained their foreign character. In the midst of what can be described as a deluge of foreign goods and ideas that come together with their names and descriptions, there appeared a new institution that never had an equivalent in the past, the Academy of Arabic. This institution, which appeared separately in several Arab countries without any meaningful coordination, undertook the task of suggesting or creating equivalent terms to those appearing in modern texts for which Arabic had no equivalent native terms. These academies, together with the Bureau for the Coordination of Arabization efforts, which belongs to Alexo, have accumulated a huge number of terms, but most of these have remained unused because there has never been a coordinated decision to Arabize the language of instruction and to outlaw publications in which foreign terminology continues to dominate discourse. Terms that are listed in the publications of the Bureau for the Coordination of Arabization can acquire currency only if used in other publications and in public forums of discussion. If published, words like if they remain cloistered in the files of the academies and their published word lists, they will suffocate for lack of light and oxygen. A few problems remain, however, that have to do with the nature of Arabic as a language that lacks prefixes and or suffixes, with more or less fixed meanings that can be attached to words to modify their sense in predictable ways. I will concentrate here on the prefixes used in English. These elements have seemed attractive not only to some translators, but even to lexicographers, like Munir Baalbaki, who has ventured to coin words from Arabic elements on the analogy of what English does. Here are a few examples from Al-Baalbaki. Bay Maktabi, meaning inter-office. Bay Shakhsi, meaning interpersonal. Bay Kawkabi, interplanetary. Allah Mutakharrij, undergraduate. Tah Ardi, Tah, not Taht, Tah Ardi, underground. Tah Bahri, undersea. Ba'di Doctorati, postdoctoral. Khilfi Mahwari, post-axial. Khilfi Qalbi, post-cardinal. Khilfi Anfi, post-nasal. Ba'di Tufani, post-diluvian. Siri Dhati, autobiographic. In doing this, Baalbaki gave himself the right to introduce prefixes that are not part of the language, disregarding the fact that lexicographers do not invent linguistic terms. They only record them if they exist. Kamal Abu Deeb, a respectable scholar in his own field, went even further in imitating English and filled his translation of Edward Said's Orientalism with words like the following ones. Al-ijtisadi, socio-economic. Ij means socio. Al-ijtimasi, socio-political. Al-shi'riyat, poetics. Al-Igri Latini, Greco-Latin. اقتباس رشيمي, epigraph. التكوكبية, satellite relationships. الجغراسي, geopolitical. ذا جامعي, ذا meaning extra, ذا جامعي, extra academic. الزي علمي, الزي means الزائف or something like it, pseudoscience, scientific. Askaraniya, the militaristic. Awalimi madaini, cosmopolitan. Lagency, lay meaning laysa. Lagency, asexual. Lay tarihi, ahistorical. Malhawi, tragicomic. Malhawi is rather strange. Anyway, I am interested in reading you or for you the following footnote, which I find rather interesting. The latest example of this regrettable practice is the use of the ugly prefix fart, fa-ram-ra-ta, to create a new word representing supersonic. The term fart sauti requires the prefix to remain separate and yet to be pronounced with a sukun. We say fart, not farto sauti or farti sauti or farta sauti, fart sauti, as if the prefix were part of the next word. However, you look at it, it violates the nature of the Arabic language. I hope that this fart will not be attached to market to give us a new word, a new howler like fart market for supermarket. It is easy to criticize these inventions as typical of their adventurous creators, but we will probably have to accept them at one point in time. Among many other problems that bedevil the process of translation, I would like to mention briefly one that has to do with translators. It is obvious that the translator who undertakes the task of translation must be competent enough in the foreign language that he or she undertakes to render into Arabic. Unfortunately, the translator's competence in the target language, Arabic in this case, is sometimes not as good as it should be. In addition to errors in grammar, sometimes even in spelling, the translator is often guilty of following the sentence structure of the foreign language and producing sentences that may be called translationese, on the analogy of journalese. Arabic, like any other language, consists of words that can be put in a particular order that is peculiar to the language. Normal English sentences usually follow the subject-verb-object form. Arabic has two basic patterns: subject, predicate, that is in the verbless sentence, or verb, subject, object, when there is a verb. But English frequently has modifiers of the verb at the beginning of the sentence, whereas Arabic normally puts the modifiers after the verb. Because the translators in question think that translation means following the word order of English, they produce sentences that sound odd in Arabic. Illustration of this behavior requires longer passages than I have time for in the present circumstances, but the clearest illustration may be gathered for the tendency of English to introduce spoken words in direct quotations before the verb that introduces the words. Here is a simple example. The quotation is, "Where did you put the book, my dear?" He said. The Arabic equivalent of this, "أين وضعت الكتاب يا عزيزتي?" قال. Here, there is no question of mistranslating the meaning. It's only a question of confusing the word order in Arabic. وقال, قال, is a transitive verb, and the subject and the object, مقول القول, that is, must follow, not precede the verb. A habit of English style is also illustrated in the fact that the circumstances of the action indicated by the verb is or are given before the action is stated. Arabic prefers to state the action and then to narrate the circumstances in which it has taken place. To do justice to a sentence of this type, the word order must be rearranged to fit the normal style of the target language. Let me conclude on a somewhat more positive note. When Aristotle's Poetic was translated in the 3rd Hijri century, the translator faced two basic terms that we now know as tragedy and comedy. Since the ancient Arabs had no knowledge of drama or theater, the translator could do little more than borrow the original Greek terms and wrote them as tragodia and komodia. There is nothing odd in this, for we still borrow the same terms, now written as tragedia and comedia, under the influence of English. But Averroes, or as Ibn Rushd was known in the Middle Ages, preferred instead to use the terms madih and hija instead of the two problematic terms. Was he wrong? I would say not. I would say he was not. For Greek tragedy normally dealt with the life of a person distinguished for his mental and physical capabilities, who usually was either a king or a great leader. But he committed a grave error which his community would not pardon, and so he was punished by violent death. This is typical of the panegyric in Arabic poetry. The panegyric in in our culture, is a poem about a distinguished personality. It describes him with all the praise that he deserves. Although the typical panegyric does not end in the death of the person so eulogized, the other form of the poem, in praise of someone, the elegy, completed what the panegyric started and described the end, and described the dead person as joining a special group of immortals. In other words, tragedy involves both types of poems, that written in praise of a great person while alive, and that written in praise of him after his death. As for Commedia or Commedia, the main character therein is a person who is lower than the members of the audience, and are in terms of than the members of the audience are in terms of intelligence and moral values. Let me reread that sentence again, please. As for Commedia or Commedia, the main character therein is a person who is lower than the members of the audience are in terms of intelligence and moral values. He is not the kind of personality that we punish by death, but by laughter and exclusion. We laugh at him and satirize his physical and mental shortcomings in poetry that we call hijab. But the two Arabic terms, madih and hijab, have not acquired sufficient acceptance among the literati and remained confined within the traditional literary critical language that confines madih to the extolment of the traits of a distinguished man of the community, and confines hijab to an expose of certain physical and moral defects in the person who happens to displease the poet in some way. The reason for this is that drama, the theater, remained unknown to us until the second half of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th, when it was easier for us to understand the terms tragedy and comedy by referring to Racine and Molière, or to Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Asfour, for such a very informative and insightful and exciting talk. I will leave now the time and the opportunity for others to ask questions or to make any comments or remarks. Yes. Well, I might ask you about something that's quite related to your book about translation. Actually, I always feel that it's one of these books that can act as a really very good source and resource to translators. Is it just possible quickly to tell us more about the way you thought about it, because again, it is about the challenges. There are a lot of very, practical, very helpful examples of how to go about translation. I remember and I really used this, it was very helpful to understand, and I feel that it's very helpful also for us as English teachers to understand elegy, the poem of, what's his name? I forgot the name of the poet, but I mean the elegy.
Thomas Gray, maybe.
Yes. And you provided your reader with many kind of translations, okay? And you offered your own translation. So yeah, again, could we say that again, is there that perfect translation, or is it something that is also an ongoing, that there always will be a new version of translated work? What do you think about that?
That's a very good question. In terms of poetry, as I mentioned, I think somewhere, that poetry is what is lost in translation. That is, the poetry in English, when translated to Arabic, it usually loses something. However, if the translator is a poet himself, he usually writes an equivalent poem. using the material that he borrows from the original poem, but he transforms it into his own kind of language, into his own kind of poetry. This is what I have tried to do in my translation of some of Shakespeare's sonnets and of a poem by Rudyard Kipling and others. That is, the idea is that here is a poem, let's say, by Rudyard Kipling. It's called, what is it called?
If.
It's called If.
It's such a brilliant translation.
It's a good poem, okay, but I have chosen to write it as a poem in Arabic with a mono-rhyme, okay? His poem, of course, is not a mono-rhymed poem. It uses the English patterns of rhyming. Now, in addition to that, to the rhymes, I've used a traditional meter. And the traditional meter in the poem obviously expresses the attitude of the Arab speaking or reciting poetry. I have also added a few ideas, images here and there from the Arabic language, which I think made the poem, that is Rudyard Kipling's If, into the poem by Mohammad Asfour. Obviously, translation, but it's a translation that is, well, it tries to be a creative one. Same is done with the sonnets of Shakespeare. I have translated one of the poems in which the addressee in Shakespeare's poem is a man. He addresses a man in the poem. In my translation, I have changed the addressee into a female. And of course, the poem varies in its impact accordingly. As for translation into prose, that is, the translator translates a book written originally in prose, and obviously the translation has to be in prose. Now, my advice to translators is to believe that there is always room for improvement. And that improvement has to do with the language itself. If there are errors in grammar, correct them. If there are errors in spelling, correct them. What is difficult to correct is the structure of the Arabic, the structure of the word, or the structure of the sentence. The structure of the English sentence is different from the structure of the Arabic sentence. Now, the translator writes Arabic. He doesn't simply translate a series of words. He translates ideas. And these ideas can be expressed in English in the English word order, but it should be translated in Arabic by using the Arabic word order. And that requires a rearrangement and, of course, a rethinking sometimes of the words and phrases that can be used. And therefore, translators have to believe that there is always room for improvement, and keep it until you are absolutely satisfied that you can no longer do anything better. Obviously, there is always room for improvement, because others might suggest to you when they read your paper or your book that this sentence is rather odd, it should be like that. This always happens.
Yeah. Any?
Hello.
Yeah. I don't see any.
This is Munir. Can I speak?
Yeah, sure. Please do. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to join the academic forum. I have a question for Dr. Mohammad on the major statement in your publication, which is where you're saying that poetry is what is lost in translation. Even though translation is not my cup of tea, however, I have come across studies where, for instance, the Brazilian scholar Borges is saying the opposite, and he's often saying that translations are often better than originals. So I don't know what you think about this opposite direction, where the Brazilian scholar translator Borges is saying the opposite and is defending the view that translations are in many cases much better than the original text. Thank you very much.
Thank you. the phrase that the poetry is what is lost in translation is actually not mine. It is originally Robert Frost's, the American poet. That is, I'm borrowing the idea from him. But back to the idea of a translation being better than the original, that can happen. It is possible if the original writer is a sloppy writer. That is, if what is translated not because of the language or the style, but because of the ideas or the information. As you know, many books are translated because of the information or the ideas that they give, not because of their literary style. Now, in this case, it's quite possible that the translation might be better because the original writer is a sloppy writer whose English or his whatever the original language is, whose language was his native language is not as good as it should be. But that is the exception rather than the rule, because governments usually do not allow bad books to be published without those books being gone through by an editor. The editor in English, editor that who belongs either to the government or to the publisher, has the final word on what is good and what is not so good. Now, there is no doubt that some publishers want to save some money, and they do not employ a good editor to improve the language of the original manuscript. I'm not talking about these. I'm talking about the respectable publishers, whether in America or England or anywhere. They do not allow a book to be published unless it goes through the difficult process of editing the text and suggesting improvements.
I'm sorry. Don't they say in Italian that translation is treason? They have the word that they rhyme together. That's always that the translator is a traitor in a way or another to the original one, because you can never be able to really capture especially in terms of sounds, in terms of so many things when we talk about poetry. But again, sometimes, as you said, some translators, they do really make a better version of the original, depending on also the power and the strength and the experience of the translator as well, that's capable of capturing the spirit and the literary merits in terms of sounds, in terms of images, and can render them into the target language. So I mean, it's quite controversial. It's not something that I believe we can just be a clear 100% about, or sure. Yeah. Professor Jihad, I think you, but unmute. We can't hear you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Asfour, for this very interesting talk. Translation problems are many. I just want to highlight one problem that is associated with scholarly texts, with research papers. When someone translates a research paper or study, he or she encounters cited authors. That is, for instance, Asfour reported X. This is from English into Arabic, not Arabic into English, English into Arabic. And now the translator faces a problem, a challenge. Is it ذكر عصفور or ذكرت عصفور? And when the translator goes back to the list of references, unfortunately, he or she finds Asfour, M.
Right.
This could mean Muna, this could mean Mohammad, and thus there is a problem. And one has to work hard to get it resolved. And the problem here sometimes is aggravated because you try to find the original piece of research, to find the first name, and you can't find it. And sometimes you need a picture really to decide, because you find it as is, Asfour, for instance, in the original. And we went through this, and sometimes you can't find really the original because it's old. It's an old reference. And one has to develop strategies to go around this. Definitely there are strategies, and I went through this myself, but the problem is there. And because you mentioned the governments and editors, particularly in the West, I think it's very useful also for publishers to step in and to insist in list of references on the first author, the name of the first author. This is what we are doing in IJAS, because this makes the life of the translator easier. And just probably because of time, we went into this and we went and found a number of books translated by professors from English into Arabic. And we found that there was a generalization. All female scientists and researchers were turned into male researchers. And this, of course, affects the naturalness of the text, in addition to the value, the truth value of it. How would you react to this, Professor Asfour, through your vast experience? Thank you.
This is a very interesting question, and obviously it indicates a practitioner of the art of translation. But I have to start by saying this, that is, scholars can be excused for making mistakes. Translators are never excused. The reason is that the translator is supposed to keep digging until he finds the truth. Now, how can that happen? If the translator lives in the present world, that is, if he is still alive, and his book has been published by a well-known, let's say, publisher, he can ask the publisher, but not rely on his sense of whether this is male or female, that is M is Mohammad or Muna. That is not enough. The translator is never forgiven for a mistake in grammar, in spelling, in factual information, in anything. To simply illustrate this from personal practice, my last translated book, which is called Places of Mind by Timothy Brennan. It's a biography of Edward Said. Timothy Brennan mentioned many names of people, and the names I'm not familiar with. And therefore I wrote to the author asking him to tell me how to pronounce these words so that I might be able to write the proper spelling of the word, of the name, not to follow the practice of many translators who tend to elongate the vowels so that instead of the kasra, they use the ya, instead of the fatha, they use the alif, instead of the dhamma, they use the waw. Why? Because it happens to be a fatha. It happens to, well, for example, Timothy is not Timothy. Okay, I have read a review of the original book by a well-known writer and journalist. He wrote the name Timothy, Timothy. Yeah, wow, yeah, okay. But his name is not Timothy. His name is Timothy. As far as the gender of the translator, I think the publisher can be helpful maybe other scholars can know or could have found the gender of the translator. But if no measure succeeds, then he might simply indicate that he's not sure. But enough, I'm not sure whether this is Muhammad or Lamuna. I don't know. In other words, simply to exonerate himself, to show that he has done all that was possible for him to find out, but he couldn't because the circumstances are such that nobody could help him. But it's an important point.
Thank you very much indeed. In fact, just if Dua allows me, in our case, we maneuvered and we said, for instance, وفي دراسة لعصفور جاء كذا وجاء في دراسة لعصفور.
Yeah, that's fine. This is good.
Yes.
Well,
it looks practical.
It's a way of simply excusing oneself from a difficulty or extricating oneself from a difficulty.
Right.
Yes, Dr. Aziz, Professor Aziz. Please.
Thank you so much, Professor Asfour, for this interesting, very educational discourse seminar. And I love the way you phrased, like when you said, like translators are not excused. They have to keep digging till they find the truth. I think this is, yes. But also I like the last comment of Professor Jihad when he said, according to Asfour, حلو مخرج. This is like you can find an exit, a detour to escape the dilemma. Actually, I just wanted to just say a little point pertinent to the academies and their efforts. Now we have many academies, Arab academies in the Arab world, but I don't think they coordinate their efforts, their work. They endeavor to render like a meaning of new commodities, but their attempt is not always a success. We're flooded with technological, social, economical commodities like every day. And I don't know to what extent, like, academies have been a success. And I'm part of these academies. I'm the vice president of the Yemeni Academy, Arab Academy. What makes it thornier is the fact that, like, the academies are not well staffed, and they just like get together once every, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 months. And once like they get together to coin a term, the term has spread, has gone into like flame. And people, of course, once the commodity is there, they just like use the word that comes with it. So a couple of years ago, I did a little study trying to see to what extent like university students would be using the Arabic terms relating to technological terms, like, for example, copy, paste, scan, mouse, and so on. And interestingly enough, 80% of the students opted for the English terms, the foreign terms, whether English or French. They would not, for example, be using Farah because, we failed in the academies to give a better term. Who would be using Farah? So they would be using mouse, for example, or a shabaka al-ankabutiyya. Even in cases like where like academies were fined, they coined like a word for mobile. Some of them said jawal, others said naqal, others yet said khaylawi, and so on. So each like academy coined the term, and at the end, people started using mobile. Now, who's using naqal or jawal or khaylawi? When you use, for example, a word like remote control, I remember like 20 years ago, I went to my village, and I mentioned this in one of my papers, and I was watching TV. There was an older lady who for the first time like saw a remote control, and then I just stepped outside for a little bit, and the child like got a grip of the mobile, of the remote, and she said, "Hasib al-walad yaksir al-mugallab." I said, "This is great word that you're looking for. This is exactly the word." And I thought, well, if this older lady could coin this word, how come like people in the academies are like this? I mean, I don't know how to put it tactfully, but like they are not helping. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may, the effort of the academies is useless unless there is a political will on the part of the Arab governments to actually make Arabic a compulsory language for all colleges and specializations. Obviously, many people resist this, and the resistance is because they have been influenced by what it feels like to be educated, for example, in Britain or France or America. And of course, speaking a foreign language gives them a sense of pride, a false pride that means nothing, but that happens. And it all has to do with a political will on the part of the Arab world to start respecting its own native language and using it for teaching all subjects. It's possible, takes time, it takes efforts, but can be done.
Yes, it can be done. I
Thank
second
you.
this. Yeah. Well, I think this is a major and very important point to discuss, I think, later on. But I mean, it is no one can excel in any other language but his own language. And there's nothing wrong. And that's why translation is extremely important in this particular, field, because it allows us to open up to the world and to know what they're doing and and to adopt and adapt and do all these kind of processes in order for us to be able to, follow up or to catch up and all these things. But I think, yes, Arabic is, I think it's time that we have to take this seriously. Maybe it should be more a point of discussion later on, Professor Jihad, the use of Arabic. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's any other comments, questions, queries, any remarks. So I think we can call it a day then. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Asfour, for everything, and especially for being my great mentor. I'll always feel very lucky to have been educated. As they say, it feels much better and beautiful in Arabic. Okay. And thank you, everybody, for your time, for being with us today. And hope to see you next time in our fourth, event and discussion. Okay, let's say good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Sure.
Good night.
Have a very good night.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor
Thank you very
Mohammad.
much,
Thank you,
Professor.
دكتور محمد، شكرا، يعطيك العافية.
شكرا لكم على الدعوة.